Hi, I'm Moby, and I'm here at Matter in London, and I'm really looking forward to playing tonight. I was born in New York City in 1965, born in Harlem on 168th Street, and I only lived in Harlem for the first 2 years of my life. My dad was a school teacher there, and then my mother and I moved to San Francisco for 1969, and then we moved to Connecticut where she had grown up. So I've always lived, except for that brief period of time when I was quite young living in San Francisco, I've always lived very close to New York City. And it's interesting because now New York is an incredibly safe place. It's an incredibly affluent place. And when I was growing up, New York was like Belfast meets Beirut meets Sarajevo. I mean, it was just entire blocks were burned down and bombed out, and there were drugs everywhere and crime everywhere and people getting murdered left and right. And it's just amazing that it's still the same city and it's so safe and clean. I grew up in one of the wealthiest towns in the world, Darien, Connecticut. The only problem being my mother and I were very, very poor. So I grew up dirt poor in this wealthy town, and my mother and I was on welfare and government assistance and food stamps. So that was very strange. So we would live in this very wealthy town at times, and then other times we lived in the ghetto. When I first left home, when I was about 19, 20 years old, I moved to an abandoned factory in a crack neighborhood, and that was really interesting because and I tell people this and they don't believe me, I had no running water and I had no bathroom, and it was in the middle of a neighborhood where people would get shot left and right. I mean, you'd go to sleep to the sound of gunshots, you'd wake up to the sound of chickens. That's the sound of the ghetto, everybody had chickens and roosters. Yeah, so that was an interesting place to live. And in the building where I lived in this crack neighborhood, I was only there for about 3 years, and in that time, at least 2 people were murdered in the building. Not in the whole town, just literally in the building I was in. Yeah. New York is a city of roughly 10 million people, and I guess it's similar to LA or San Francisco or London or Manchester. These cities are magnets, you know, so if you live anywhere near New York, you end up in New York. If you want to be an artist, if you want to be a musician, a photographer, a writer, anything, you have to go to New York. Like, no musician can have a career living an hour away from New York City. So you have to, because that's where the record companies were, it's where the nightclubs were, it's where the bars were, it's where the musicians were, it's where everything was. So that's why I had to move back. When I was very young, I grew up playing classical music. From the time I was 9 till 13, I played classical music and studied music theory. And then when I was 13 or 14, I heard The Clash, and I fell in love with it. And so I really loved not just punk rock, but a lot of like post-punk and new wave, you know. And I was influenced by the Sex Pistols and Public Image, but Joy Division and Echo and the Bunnymen and Theater of Hate and Killing Joke. And what I loved about that scene, like the post-punk scene from 78 to about 83, is it was so eclectic. You know, the bands would use percussion and synthesizers and drum machines and guitars, and it didn't really matter what you would do. Like, you just use whatever was available. And I really liked that approach to making music. The way Go came into being, it was the second single I ever released, and the original version of Go was actually very minimal. It was this very minimal techno track, and then I was doing a remix, and I added the Twin Peaks strings. It's called Laura Palmer's theme, and at the time Twin Peaks was hugely popular, and so somehow the success of Twin Peaks carried on to this song Go. And Go was released as an underground dance song that ended up being a top 10 record all around the world, which was completely surprising, because when I made it, I was hoping that it would sell 3,000 copies, and that maybe some DJs in New York would play it. That's really all that I wanted. the thing is, I don't think of myself as being an innovative musician at all. Whenever I've made records, all I'm doing is sort of being inspired by other people's records. So, like some of my early records had a lot of gospel vocals and pianos, and I was just inspired by people like Marshall Jefferson and Daryl Pandy and things on the Big Beat label and stuff that Tony Humphries would play. And then I was also inspired by the like the late 80s, early 90s rave scene. So if I look back at the records I've made, I don't think any of them are terribly original. I mean, I think I've made some music that I like, but there's nothing that I've done first, because I was just being inspired by other people.
Couldn't live without you when I tried to roam.
I have what's supposedly the world's fastest record. It's called 1000, and even that was actually inspired by, I think it was Sven Vath. Sven Vath, if I remember correctly, was DJing in New York at this club called NASA, and he had a song that started at 135 beats per minute and went up to 170 beats per minute. And I remember thinking to myself, well, why stop at 170? So I went home and started at 135 and went up to about 1100 beats per minute. When the album Play came out, it didn't sell very well. Radio didn't really like it, press didn't really like it. It slowly became successful. And so when it first came out, I didn't expect it to sell anything. And then it slowly became successful, and I had a video camera with me while I was touring, and I kept documenting different things to keep myself entertained, basically. And so in 2001, I think, we put out a DVD, and I've since we put out a DVD for Play and for the album 18, and also I think for Hotel. I don't think we did one for the last record, but it's, when you're making a record, you have remixes and you have videos and you have all this different footage, and you might as well put it in one place, so that way if anybody's interested, they can look at it. I mean, DVDs, even with the album Play, Play sold around 10 million copies, and the DVD, I think, sold 150,000 copies. So clearly, not too many people are interested in DVDs.
Let me see outside. Look at all the places.
When Play came out, I toured and toured and toured, and I somehow found myself having a weird degree of success that I hadn't been expecting. And this friend of mine came to me and said, "Oh, you're touring, why don't you put together your own festival?" And I thought that sounded like fun. So I basically put together the most eclectic, strange festival I could think of. So it was, I mean, that year I think it was like Digweed and Paul Oakenfold and what's that? And Nelly Furtado and New Order and Outkast and The Roots and Incubus. And it was really, I mean, just really just bizarre and eclectic.
Where all my family died.
In 2000, I think it was 2003, thereabouts, I recorded this album Hotel. Maybe it's 2004. And I wanted to make a more song-oriented record, and I wanted to see what it was like to make a record in a big studio. So I went to a big studio with a great engineer, and we produced everything really, really professionally. And it was me singing, and it's a very clean record, and it's a very professional record. And I like the songs on it, I just don't like the way I produced it. Because I like strange, eclectic underground records. I don't like big, professional, polished, commercial records. So with that album Hotel, even though I like the songs on it, it's the one album I've made that I'm really not happy with the way it sounds, because it's just too clean. There's this movie that Jeff Goldblum made called Pittsburgh, and my friend Ileana Douglas is in it, and she asked me to be in it, and I've always really liked Jeff Goldblum, and it wasn't acting, because it's all improvised. So I don't know how to act. They basically said that I was supposed to be Ileana Douglas's awful boyfriend in the movie, so I just simply pretended to be an awful boyfriend. first went to university, I went to a place called University of Connecticut, and it was an agricultural school in the middle of Connecticut, and I dropped out because I was very depressed. And then I went back to school at a place called SUNY Purchase, which was an amazing school, even though I was a philosophy major, but it's a performing arts school. I mean, Wesley Snipes went there and Parker Posey went there, and it's music and theater and film. It was really, really interesting place. And when I was there, I made friends with a lot of people in the world of independent film. And I've since stayed friends with people in that world of indie film, and they always complain about how hard it is to license music for small films. So a couple of years ago, I started this website called mobygratis.com that very simply just gives free music to indie filmmakers. So any indie filmmaker, any film student can go to mobygratis.com and the music is free. For anyone who uses mobygratis.com, my hope is that it's the single easiest part of making a movie. Like, it's just be like, click, it's done. Well, 2007, 2008, I was living in New York and I was going out all the time. And there was this new, almost like a new wave of dance music in New York. You know, things like DFA and Trouble and Bass and this club in Brooklyn, Studio B. And so it's like all of a sudden all these kids were getting interested in dance music, and I would go out and hear 21-year-olds DJ, and they'd be playing Inner City, and they'd be playing Todd Terry, and they'd be playing Derek May, and I just thought that was so cool. And so I was going out and I was drinking a lot and I was taking a lot of drugs and I was staying up until 5 o'clock in the morning, almost having like a second adolescence. And so I wanted to make a record that to me sounded like a night out in New York. And so I made this album Last Night. That's what it's called, Last Night. And it was just supposed to be a dance record that somehow, in a vague way, approximated a 12-hour night out in New York. On June 30th, 2009, I'm putting out an album called Wait For Me, and it's a record that I made in my bedroom, so it's more melodic, and it's a very private record, a very personal record, because I realized that there are two types of music. There's public music and private music. Public music is music that you listen to in a bar or a nightclub or at a party, and private music is music that you listen to on your own at home. And the last album, Last Night, that was public music. That's, you know, if you're having a party, you play that record. And this album, Wait For Me, it's a private record. You know, it's a record you listen to on headphones, or you listen to Sunday morning when it's raining outside. So it's more mournful and melancholy and melodic and contemplative. So that's the record that's coming out. And it's also the first time I've ever basically put a record out on my own. Like, in the past, I was on Mute Records, and then Mute got bought by EMI, so then I was on EMI Records, and now I'm on my own record label. It's called Little Idiot Records, and even though I'm licensing it around the world to different companies, I'm basically putting it out myself. And as a result, it enables me to make some really fun, completely uncommercial decisions. Like, the first single from this album, Wait For Me, is an instrumental song called Shot in the Back of the Head that can never get played on radio. And the video for it is by David Lynch. So it's like a first single that will never get played on the radio with a video that can never get played on TV. And that's the joy of not being signed to a major label, is I can, of my own free will, make really fun, interesting, creative decisions that are completely uncommercial.